As the 2020 coronavirus pandemic that started in China shakes the world, one may wonder about similar events happening in the past. Throughout its history, China has been the most populated area in the world, still counting today about 18.5% of the world's population. As nature proved time and time again, large communities, accumulated with particularly bad circumstances, were the perfect breeding ground for severe epidemics and pandemics. A particularly infectious disease that would cause 3 pandemics in world history would become well known in the Chinese civilization. This is a story of the plague in China. The term plague has often been used for various large and lethal historical epidemics. Today, plague refers to the disease caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis, a definition to which I'll stick to in this video. The plague and China are infamously linked. To this day, the disease is still present in the country, as several cases were recorded in November 2019. Scientists believe the plague to have originated in Central Asia thousands of years ago, though it soon spread to China, where it would stay throughout the ages. While it has been hypothesized that both the first 2 plague pandemics, the plague of Justinian and the Black Death, began in China, this cannot be conclusively proven. Nonetheless, the country would be subject to many epidemics itself. The first major outbreak in China that might have been caused by the plague was recorded during the transition between the Sui and the Tang dynasties around the 7th and 8th century. Several scientists and historians believe it to have been an outbreak of bubonic plague, from descriptions of bubons forming on the bodies of victims given in historical records. Sources of these events are however scarce and unclear. Later in history, the aftermath of the Mongol conquests would be responsible for the outbreak of the second plague pandemic, infamously known as the Black Death, that decimated somewhere between 30 and 60% of the European population. Many people have hypothesized that the pandemic originated in China, similarly to the first pandemic, the plague of Justinian. However, evidence of this is inconclusive in both cases. It is more likely that the Black Death pandemic began in Central Asia during the first half of the 14th century. The first cases were located in the Golden Horde, one segment of the Mongol Empire. Cases grew into an epidemic, which promptly spread throughout the trade routes of the Mongol Empire. As it was spreading towards the west, it also spread towards China, where the Mongols had established the Yuan dynasty. Mongol rule in China was however crumbling, and a massive outbreak of the disease was reported during 1353 and 1354. Historical accounts of this wave of the plague indicate the epidemic located in several northern and southern provinces. Figures suggest that around 1 million deaths were the consequence of the epidemic in only those 2 years. But as the country descended into civil unrest, many more diseases spread. For the Han Chinese people, the Yuan dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven. Small local revolts grew into the Red Turban Rebellion, which overthrew the Yuan dynasty and successfully drove the Mongols out of China, establishing the Ming dynasty in 1368. While the war itself certainly took many lives, most of them were probably claimed by the massive famines and diseases, including the plague. In total, tens of millions of people died during this troubled period, roughly half of Chinese population. Following these events, the situation was stabilized. Occasional epidemics that took place during the Ming dynasty's rule were always quenched without dramatically shaking the country. For a while, China thrived. The situation changed rapidly during the 17th century. Amidst the collapse of the Ming dynasty, burdened by corruption, rebellions, and foreign invasions, the accumulation of military conflict, floods, and famine made a perfect terrain for epidemics to spread. In 1641, dysentery in Suzhou killed about 70% of the infected population. Nanjing was also hit by the disease, reporting tens of thousands of dead. Soon later, in 1644, the bubonic plague broke out in Shanxi region. Local records report, "In the autumn there was a great epidemic. The victims first developed a hard lump below the armpits or between the thighs, or else would cough thin blood and died before they had the time to take medicine. Even friends and relations did not dare to ask after the sick or come with their condolences. There were whole families wiped out with no one to bury them. The staggering toll of this new plague outbreak reported between 80 and 90% of the population dying, since the Ming dynasty was busy being replaced by the Manchu invaders of the Qing dynasty. The people were left to their own devices. Many in the population believed this was a proof of the Ming dynasty having lost the mandate of heaven, which would be claimed in turn in 1644 by the 5-year-old Emperor Shunzhi of the Qing dynasty. As I explained earlier, it is unlikely that the first two plague pandemics, the plague of Justinian and the Black Death, originated in China. Such cannot be said for the third. What would become known as the Plague of China probably began in the 1760s during the reign of Emperor Qianlong. The epidemic started out in Yunnan province at the same time as the Sino-Burmese War that shook the region, which probably worsened the situation. The disease was originally confined to western Yunnan province, but as several decades went by, the disease was able to spread. Yongqing dynasty poet Shi Daonan famously contracted the disease and wrote a frightful poem describing the scenes around him. Dead rats in the east, dead rats in the west. People see dead rats as if they saw tigers. A few days after the death of a rat, men fall like collapsing walls. Numberless people die in a day. The sun is dark and gloomy. Shi Daonan died of illness shortly after. During the first couple of decades of the 19th century, the plague had reached all of the region. For the time being, this bubonic plague outbreak was still only present in the mountainous region of Yunnan province. Around the 1830s, the epidemic even seemed to subside. However, as the tumultuous events of the 19th century rocked China and its population, massive migrations took place. The local Pantai rebellion of the Muslim Hui people was most likely the cause of the plague re-emerging in the 1850s. The epidemic promptly began spreading towards the east through coastal trade, reaching Guangxi by the 1860s, then Hainan and Guangdong in the 1870s. Finally, in the 1890s, the plague epidemic had reached the Pearl River Delta and its massive international trading ports of Macau, Hong Kong and Canton, or Guangzhou. From these ports, the disease would eventually reach all continents and most nations, turning from an epidemic to the third plague pandemic. In China, the situation was far from resolved. The plague developed alongside the coast further east and north. In March 1894, Canton was heavily struck, reporting 60,000 deaths in only a few weeks. Preoccupied by political instability and war with other nations, the Qing authorities remained largely uninvolved. By May 1984, the disease reached the British territory of Hong Kong and began to spread there. Thanks to the development of Western medicine, the British understood an immediate response was crucial. British Governor William Robinson immediately took the matter in his hands and ordered his soldiers to carry out inspections and displace the infected victims. An estimated 7,000 people were subsequently isolated and many homes destroyed. Since there was no cure yet, British doctors could do little for the patients and often gave them strong doses of alcohol in their dying days. Overall, these isolation tactics proved effective and the epidemic was successfully controlled, as from 2,500 cases reported in 1894, only 44 were noted the following year. The plague would nonetheless remain in Hong Kong until as late as 1929. Meanwhile, a large part of the local Chinese community grew resentful to the British authorities, who, in addition to displacing its members, were unable to process all the dead bodies, often disposing of them unceremoniously. A large part of the community emigrated and left Hong Kong, increasing the risk of spreading the disease. In parallel to the British response to the epidemic, the Chinese authorities lacked Western knowledge and could not provide its stricken population with adequate response. Consequently, the Chinese doctors focused mainly on preventive measures. One of them, Zheng Xiaoyan, urged the people to clean kitchens and drains, sweep up dust, and move to the countryside, where he believed the fresh air would dissipate the disease. Concerning actual treatment, most of them proved largely ineffective and relied on medicinal plants that became extremely expensive during outbreaks. With no isolation measures undertaken, people in Chinese territory kept on dying in the tens of thousands. As professionals tried to solve the issue, many explanations for the plague came up in the population. Some accused the Muslims of having cast spells using black magic, others the Westerners of having poisoned the water. The most popular explanation, though, was the punishment of displeased gods. This theory would be consolidated by a new rumour. Nuns in the Canton area reported that Guan Yu, a deity of war, had appeared to them. He explained that many deities of heaven were indeed irate because of overpopulation of the world and the thriving of evil creatures in it. The gods of heaven had therefore ordered the annihilation of practically all humans and animals. The nuns then explained that Guan Yu intervened in favour of humanity. Subsequently, the gods accepted to limit this purge by using only the plague rather than full-scale pestilence. They then tasked him with overseeing the operation, commanding 1,000 demons and ghost officials. Most of the religious people accepted this explanation for the plague. Consequently, the population prayed and repented for misdeeds, in a similar fashion as Europe during the Black Death. Over the next years, large religious ceremonies were launched throughout southern China, with fireworks and firecrackers, lanterns and feasts. In Yunnan province, where people were less wealthy, they used bells, drums and firearms to make noise to scare off the demons. Soldiers were also mobilized to stab the air in the intent of killing evil spirits. While the cause of the plague was identified as a bacteria in the flea parasite in 1894 by French doctor Alexandre Yersin, who soon began working on cures, the Westerners did not make the connection between fleas and rats yet. The Chinese, though, had understood that rats were somehow linked with the disease. Dead rats were therefore often buried outside of the cities, and officials occasionally offered money for them. They ordered the streets to be cleaned and plague victims' clothes to be burnt. Other than that, most measures were organized by wealthier citizens, rather than the authorities. During the following years, in the eve of the 20th century, Westernization of the Chinese Empire slowly allowed the situation to ease as dedicated sanitary quarters and isolation hospitals were created. The plague was therefore reduced to occasional outbreaks. However, as the situation was getting better, the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1912 would precipitate China into decades of civil war. With no strong central government, the populations were left largely to their own devices, allowing the plague to persist for several more years. The final large-scale plague epidemic in China occurred in 1910. This time, it would not concern the tropical south of the country, but the frozen hills of Manchuria. In another difference, the bubonic plague would not be the cause of the epidemic. Its other form, the pneumonic plague, would claim the lives of over 60,000 victims. The causation was hypothesized to be of animal origin, from a species of rodent, the Tarbagan marmot, hunted for its fur. Since the development of industry allowed for fake fur to be mass-produced, the authentic material became much more expensive. Consequently, many people looking for work undertook the hunting of the Tarbagan marmot on a large scale. Inexperienced hunters could not identify and avoid diseased animals, and most likely were the first link in the epidemic. In the freezing Manchurian climate, they flocked together in huts used as hunting bases, allowing the disease to spread. Cases of the plague were first reported in Hailar during autumn of 1910, and soon spread through the recently built railways of the Chinese Eastern Railway to Harbin, the largest city in the north of Manchuria, in October. By early November, over 5,000 deaths were already reported. Now, knowledge of diseases and epidemics was much stronger. Russians and Chinese doctors got together and devised methods of quarantine and isolation. Any victim or suspected victim of the plague was identified and arrested. They would then be quarantined inside train carriages of the Chinese Eastern Railway until recovery or death. Migrating people were further stopped by the army at the base of the Great Wall, preventing them from entering China proper and spreading the disease there. Thanks to these measures, the epidemic was successfully confined to Manchuria only. Beijing and Tianjin did report isolated cases, but no epidemic followed. Within Manchuria, the spread of the disease had already taken place, since people were packed together in cold climates and cheap train tickets of the South Manchurian Railway were accessible to migrant workers, who had unsuspectingly brought the plague to railway cities, and from there to other cities and villages. Leading the Chinese response was Dr. Wu Lianda, a Mandarin of second rank. He had also been the first Chinese person to have studied and graduated in Cambridge University in England. He worked with his colleagues on how to solve the issue, conducting many scientific experiments. Meanwhile, the fatality rate of the plague was staggering, with hundreds of victims dying every day. Furthermore, the frozen climate made it impossible to properly bury the numberless dead. Leaving the bodies in the open was obviously a major hazard, as it would spread the disease even more. After a while, Wu Lianda received imperial permission to burn bodies of the victims, twisting the rules of Chinese morals of the times. Russian authorities administering the Chinese Eastern Railway also took measures, designing sanitary zones. Thanks to these combined efforts and intelligent measures taken, the plague epidemic that had claimed over 60,000 lives was over in less than a year by April 1911, with the final cases reported in March. The Great Manchurian Plague had disastrous effects on trade for obvious reasons, and therefore on the collapsing Qing dynasty's authority. It however also allowed Chinese scientists to be integrated into the international scientific community for the first time, as the 1911 Mukden International Plague Conference was organized to discuss the issue and further international responses to disease outbreaks. Imperial rule in China finally ended a year later in 1912, as the Republic of China was founded. In consequence of the Manchurian Plague, President Yuan Shikai legalized dissection of human bodies by 1913 that had been forbidden until then, due to Confucian beliefs, further allowing China to embrace modern science and abandon traditional practices. There would be a final outbreak of plague in Manchuria, this time man-inflicted, part of the Japanese war crimes during the Second Sino-Japanese War, but this is a subject for another video. The plague epidemics forced late Imperial China, an extremely populous empire, to modernize its medical practices under the weight of the third pandemic, and also strengthened its scientific community on the international stage after the Great Manchurian Plague events. Throughout the ages, dozens of millions of people in this civilization lost their lives to the illness, and through animal reservoirs such as the Tarbagan marmot, the plague occasionally still infects individuals to this day.
Gentlemen, that's all for today. Take care, everybody.
Thank you for watching my video, I hope you enjoyed it. If so, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions or requests, feel free to leave them in the comment section below.